A millionaire saw his ex-girlfriend with 2 kids in the park. When he looked closely, he realized the kids looked like the park buzzed with the low hum of a Houston afternoon. Children's laughter mingled with the distant whoosh of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Jackson didn't hear any of it. He walked briskly, a man accustomed to movement, to purpose, though today his mind wandered aimlessly. His polished shoes hit the path rhythmically, the weight of the day slumping his shoulders. And then he saw her. At first, it was a fleeting glimpse. A woman perched on a weathered bench, her head tilted towards the ground. 2 children played nearby, their laughter sharper, livelier than the rest. Jackson slowed, unsure what had caught his attention until the woman shifted slightly and the sunlight caught her profile. It couldn't be. His feet froze before his mind caught up. Dorothy. Her name rose unbidden, lodging itself in his throat. A careless knot tied her once glossy and sleek hair back. Her clothes hung loosely, worn fabric that told its own story. Yet it was her posture that struck him. A quiet but undeniable weariness. She sat with her hands clasped loosely, her shoulders curved inward, as if shielding herself from the world. He approached, cautiously at first, the crunch of gravel underfoot betraying his presence. She looked up, startled, her wide eyes locking onto his. "Dorothy," he said, his voice low, testing the name as if it might vanish. Her expression flickered. Recognition, panic, something else he couldn't place. She straightened, her hands moving instinctively to smooth the fabric of her skirt. "Jackson," she replied, her voice steady but cool. "It's been a while." A while? The understatement felt like a punch. 5 years. No word. No explanation. And now, here she was, sitting in a park with 2 children who couldn't have been older than 4. "I didn't expect to see you," he managed, his gaze shifting to the boys. One of them, a bright-eyed child with a mop of dark curls, laughed as he chased a fallen leaf. The other hung back, quieter, his small hand clutching the bench's edge. Dorothy followed his gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Life's full of surprises." Her tone conveyed the importance of not rushing this conversation. "Would you join me for a coffee?" He gestured toward the small cafe visible just beyond the park gates. Her hesitation was palpable. She glanced at the boys, then back at him. "I don't think... It's just coffee," he interrupted, his voice softening. "Please." A pause. The pause lingers for an extended period, leaving her feeling vulnerable. Finally, she nodded. "All right." But not for long. They walked in silence, the children trailing close behind. At the cafe, Jackson ordered 2 coffees, while Dorothy settled the boys at a corner table with 2 small glasses of juice. When she finally sat across from him, she somehow seemed smaller, her hands tightly wrapped around the ceramic mug. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice as neutral as he could manage. "Fine," she said quickly, her gaze darting to the boys. "We're getting by." Her clipped tone left little room for elaboration. Jackson leaned back slightly, studying her. The Dorothy he remembered had been vibrant, confident. This Dorothy seemed more like a shadow, her light dimmed but not extinguished. "The kids," he ventured carefully. "They're mine," she said, her tone sharp, as though daring him to ask anything further. "And their father?" He regretted the question the moment it left his lips, her eyes flashing with something. Anger, hurt, maybe both. "That's not a conversation I'm ready to have." The air between them thickened, and Jackson didn't press. Instead, he shifted the focus. They seemed like lovely kids, full of energy. Her shoulders eased slightly. "They are. Dennis is the loud one. Dennis is insatiably curious and constantly on the go. Daniel's quieter, more thoughtful. Jackson nodded, tucking away the names, the small details she offered. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Time was slipping by, and he wasn't any closer to understanding why she had vanished, or why she seemed so determined to keep the truth locked away. When they finished, he stood. "Let me walk you home." "You don't have to," she said, but there was no conviction behind it. "I want to." The walk to her apartment was silent, punctuated only by the children's chatter. When they reached the building, Jackson felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The structure was crumbling at the edges, its paint faded and peeling. A narrow staircase led up to the second floor, the handrail rusted. "Dorothy," he began, his voice trailing off as she turned to face him. "I appreciate the coffee, Jackson," she said, her tone firm, final. "Goodbye." He stood there as she climbed the stairs, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. The door gently shut behind her, yet Jackson stayed motionless, gazing intently at the building as if it were about to reveal its mysteries. And then he turned and walked away, a quiet resolve settling over him. Something had to change. The next morning, the memory of Dorothy's wary eyes lingered like a shadow over Jackson's breakfast. He stirred his coffee absently, the clink of the spoon against porcelain echoing in the otherwise silent kitchen. He had barely slept, haunted by questions and the image of her crumbling apartment building. By mid-morning, he found himself at her door again, his hand poised to knock. The hallway smelled faintly of damp plaster, and the muffled sounds of life seeped through the thin walls. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Dorothy stood there, her expression a mix of surprise and guarded resignation. "Jackson," she said, her voice low, "what are you doing here?" "I couldn't leave it like that," he replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, her grip tightening on the doorframe. From inside, the sound of laughter, high-pitched and unrestrained, spilled into the hallway. Dorothy glanced over her shoulder before stepping aside. "Fine, but keep your voice down," she said, opening the door wider. The apartment felt even smaller in the daylight. The furniture was sparse and mismatched, the walls yellowed with age. Jackson took in the sight of Dennis and Daniel, playing with a makeshift fort of blankets and chairs, their giggles a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere. Dorothy crossed her arms as Jackson turned to face her. "What do you want, Jackson?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the boys before returning to her. "Are they mine?" Her face tightened, the question hanging in the air between them. She exhaled sharply, a sound more of exhaustion than frustration. "Yes," she finally said, her voice barely audible above a whisper. "They're yours." The word struck him sharply, causing him to momentarily lose his voice. His eyes moved to the boys again, Dennis with his boundless energy, Daniel quieter, more contemplative. Now the resemblance was impossible to ignore. "5 years," he said, his voice thick. "I've had 5 years to miss out on their lives. It's been 5 years, Dorothy." "Why?" Her jaw tightened, her posture stiffening like a shield. "It's not that simple," she said, her words clipped. "Then make it simple," he countered, his frustration spilling over. "You disappeared, Dorothy. You left, and now I find out." He stopped himself, taking a deep breath. His voice softened. "I deserve to know why." Dorothy's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers brushing against the edge of the counter, as though seeking something solid to hold on to. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said after a long pause. "For them. For you. For me." The disbelief in his voice was unmistakable. "Do you think this is what I would have wanted? To find out about my sons like this?" Her silence was answer enough. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, pacing to the edge of the room and back. "They deserve better than this," he said finally, his voice steady but resolute. You can't keep living like this, Dorothy. They can't. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. What are you suggesting? Come live with me, he said, the words leaving no room for argument. Dorothy blinked, taken aback. It's not negotiable, he interrupted, his tone soft but firm. They're my children too, and I want them to have a stable home. I want you to have a stable home. Dorothy shook her head, her hands clenching at her sides. I don't need your charity, Jackson. This isn't charity, he said, stepping closer. It's responsibility. It's about giving them a chance to grow up without worrying about leaking roofs and broken heaters. He gestured around the apartment. This isn't satisfactory enough for them, Dorothy. You know that. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. She turned away, focusing on the boys, who were now watching them curiously. Give me time, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I need time to think. Jackson nodded, though his jaw tightened. Take all the time you need. But I'm not going anywhere. They're my family too. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. He looked back at her and said, For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For whatever made you think you had to do this alone. Dorothy didn't reply, but the look on her face, equal parts resolve and vulnerability, stayed with him as he walked away. Outside, the Houston air was thick and humid, clinging to his skin as he made his way to his car. His mind raced with plans, with questions. But one thought rose above the chaos. He wasn't going to let them slip away again. 3 days passed before Jackson returned. This time, he wasn't leaving without an answer. As he climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to Dorothy's apartment, his resolve hardened. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the dim hallway. The door opened just enough to reveal Dorothy's face. Jackson, she said with a sigh, her voice laced with both resignation and fatigue. You don't give up, do you? Not when it comes to this, he replied, his tone firm. I'm serious, Dorothy. The boys, Dennis and Daniel, they deserve better. You deserve better. Her grip on the door tightened. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse again. But then, she glanced over her shoulder at the cluttered apartment, the cracked walls, and the 2 little boys sitting on the floor with their makeshift toys. Give me a minute, she muttered, closing the door. When she reopened it, Dennis and Daniel were at her side, each clutching a small, hastily packed bag. Dorothy stood behind them, her expression unreadable. We'll try it, she said, her voice quieter now, but only for the boys. Don't think this changes anything between us. Jackson knelt to the boy's eye level. Hey, he said softly, smiling. You're coming to stay with me for a while. Is that okay? Dennis nodded enthusiastically, his wide eyes sparkling. Daniel, ever the quieter one, clung to his mother's leg, but gave a small, hesitant nod. The drive to Jackson's apartment was uneventful, punctuated by Dennis's excited chatter and Daniel's cautious silence. When they arrived, Jackson opened the door to his spacious, minimalist apartment, its polished surfaces and sleek furniture a stark contrast to Dorothy's cramped, worn space. Dennis darted inside, his face lighting up as he explored the living room. It's so big, he exclaimed, spinning around in the open space. Daniel hung back, his small hand clutching Dorothy's. His eyes scanned the unfamiliar surroundings, his grip tightening. Dorothy stepped in slowly, her gaze sweeping over the apartment. The high ceilings, pristine walls, and modern decor made her feel like she didn't belong. She set the boys' bags down near the couch, keeping her arms crossed as if shielding herself. You didn't have to do all this, she said, her voice low. I did, Jackson replied, his tone even. It's what they deserve. Jackson found himself torn between fascination and frustration as the hours passed. Dennis warmed up quickly, asking endless questions about the apartment and Jackson himself. "What's this for?" Dennis inquired, gesturing to a sleek coffee machine on the counter. Jackson chuckled. "That's for making coffee. Want to see how it works?" Dennis nodded eagerly, and Jackson showed him how to press the buttons, explaining each step. Daniel watched from the edge of the kitchen, his arms wrapped around his small frame. Dorothy, meanwhile, stayed in the background, observing. She observed Jackson's attempts to engage both boys, but Daniel met his efforts with quiet hesitation. Still, he didn't give up, kneeling down to Daniel's level when he spoke or offering him small gestures of encouragement. "He's shy," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of apology. Jackson glanced at her. "He's careful," he corrected gently. "That's not a negative thing." That night, Dorothy stood by the window, gazing out at the city skyline, after Jackson had hastily furnished the boys' guest room. The silence of the apartment felt almost oppressive, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. "You're quiet," Jackson said, stepping into the room. Dorothy turned, her arms still crossed. "This feels temporary," she said, simply. "Like it's not real." "It's real," Jackson said, his voice firm but kind. "And it doesn't have to be temporary." She didn't reply, her gaze drifting back to the window. Later that evening, while tidying the living room, Jackson found something tucked behind a stack of old books on a shelf. He pulled it out, a small, framed photo. His breath caught as he stared at it. It was Dorothy. The picture was from years ago, back when their world had been simpler, back when they'd believed nothing could break them. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her eyes bright with joy. He sank onto the couch, the photo still in his hand. Memories washed over him, of laughter, of promises whispered in the dark, of a future they'd once envisioned together. And then, just as suddenly, the pain of her absence resurfaced, sharp and unrelenting. Jackson sat there for a long time, the photo resting on his lap, as questions he'd long since buried resurfaced. Dorothy stood in the doorway of the boys' room, watching as Dennis animatedly showed Jackson a drawing he had made that day. Jackson was kneeling beside the bed, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. A picture of relaxed focus. Daniel sat nearby, more subdued, but his small hand rested lightly on Jackson's knee. It was a gesture of quiet trust, one that made Dorothy's chest tighten. She had seen this scene play out countless times in her mind over the years, but now witnessing it, the reality felt sharper, more complicated, relief mingled with anxiety, clawing at the edges of her resolve. She turned away, retreating to the quiet of the living room. The hum of the city outside offered little solace. Dorothy sank onto the couch, her fingers tracing the hem of her sleeve as memories began to stir, unbidden and unwanted. It was the hotel photo that had shattered everything. The image had arrived in her inbox with cruel precision. Jackson, his arm around Emma, leading her into a room. Emma's head tilted toward him, their proximity intimate, undeniable. Dorothy hadn't been able to breathe. She had stared at the screen, the edges of her vision blurring as her world collapsed. Her mind had betrayed her, replaying every loving word Jackson had ever spoken, now laced with doubt. She remembered the excuses, late meetings, work trips. She had believed him, trusted him. And yet, there was the proof, cold, stark, inescapable. She clenched her hands tightly now, the phantom ache of that moment lingering in her chest. She had left not out of anger, but out of despair. Staying had felt impossible. Facing him, pretending nothing had changed, had felt like a lie too heavy to bear. But now, as she glanced back toward the boys' room. She wondered if her choice had been a mistake. "Dorothy." Jackson's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his tie gone, his expression searching. She straightened, masking her turmoil. "What is it?" He stepped into the room, his gaze steady but laced with frustration. "I can't help but notice." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "You've been distant. You're here, but it's like you're holding something back. I can see it. The boys can feel it." Her defenses rose instantly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." His tone was firm, but not unkind. "This isn't just about the boys. It's about us. Whatever happened 5 years ago, it didn't just affect you. I lost something too." Dorothy stood, her arms crossing instinctively. "This isn't the time, Jackson." "When is the time, Dorothy? When are you going to let me in?" The question hung in the air, heavy, with unspoken truths. She turned away, her gaze fixed on the darkened skyline outside. "You don't want to know," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "Yes, I do," he insisted. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I deserve to know why you left. I deserve to know why you didn't trust me enough to stay." Her breath caught, the words cutting deeper than he could have known. She fought the urge to lash out, to deflect with anger. Instead, she swallowed hard and spoke carefully. "I left because it was the only thing I could do. For me, for the boys, for you." "For me?" he repeated, incredulous. "How is leaving me in the dark taking my sons?" "For me." Dorothy's grip on her emotions faltered. "I thought you'd moved on, Jackson," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought there was someone else." The admission silenced him, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What are you talking about?" She shook her head, refusing to elaborate. "It doesn't matter anymore." "No, it does," he said firmly. "If you thought I'd moved on, why didn't you confront me? Why didn't you ask me the truth?" Her silence was her only answer. Jackson exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "Fine," he said at last. "If you're not ready to tell me, I won't push. But I'm not letting this go, Dorothy. Not until I understand what happened." She watched him leave the room, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Later that night, Dorothy found herself standing in the hallway, her hand resting on the doorframe of the boys' room. Jackson was there again, his voice low as he read from a storybook. Dennis lay sprawled across the bed, his head propped up on his hands, while Daniel leaned against Jackson, his eyes half closed. Dorothy's breath caught at the sight. Jackson's face softened as he read, his focus entirely on the boys. It was a side of him she hadn't allowed herself to think about, a piece of the man she had loved so deeply and tried so hard to forget. But watching him now, she felt something shift, a crack in the armor she had built so carefully. She couldn't deny it. A part of her wanted to believe again. She stepped back into the shadows, unseen, her emotions a quiet storm. The morning sun bathed Jackson's sleek car in light as it cruised down the long driveway toward Patricia's estate. The towering iron gates opened smoothly, revealing manicured lawns and a sprawling mansion that screamed wealth and control. Jackson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set with a determination that hadn't waned since the previous night. The memories of Dorothy's words haunted him. "I thought you'd moved on." Her voice, trembling and raw, had left him with more questions than answers. There was only one person who might hold the missing piece of the puzzle, someone who had never supported his relationship with Dorothy, his mother, Patricia. Jackson parked outside the grand entrance, his polished shoes clicking against the stone steps as he climbed them. The heavy oak door opened before he could knock, and a well-dressed butler greeted him with a slight bow. "Mr. Carter, Your mother is expecting you in the drawing room." Jackson nodded, stepping into the house. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of fresh flowers, but there was an unshakable chill, as though the warmth of family had been left out of the architectural plans. Patricia sat poised on a cream sofa, her posture as regal as her pearls. She looked up as Jackson entered, her smile thin and controlled. "Jackson, darling, this is an unexpected visit. Coffee?" "No, thank you," he said curtly, standing near the edge of the room as if proximity alone might burn him. She arched an eyebrow. "Straight to the point, then." "Did you know Dorothy thought I was with someone else?" he asked, skipping pleasantries. Patricia blinked, her serene expression faltering ever so slightly. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "You don't?" Jackson stepped closer, his voice tight. "She left because she thought I was with Emma. She saw a photo of us going into a hotel together. A photo I didn't even know existed." Patricia's fingers tensed around her teacup before she placed it down deliberately. "And what makes you think I have anything to do with this supposed misunderstanding?" Jackson's gaze bore into her. "Because you never wanted me to be with Dorothy. Because you thought she wasn't good enough for me." Patricia's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a cold, measured look. "Jackson, you're being ridiculous. I wanted what was best for you, as any mother would." "What was best for me?" he repeated bitterly. "Do you think it was best for me to lose 5 years of my sons' lives? To have Dorothy think I betrayed her?" She rose slowly, her polished composure cracking just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "Dorothy was never right for you," she said sharply. "She would have held you back. Everything you've accomplished, everything you've built. Do you think that would have been possible with her in the picture?" Jackson's fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't about my career, Mother. It's about the woman I loved, the mother of my children. You had no right." Patricia's mouth opened as if to argue, but her words faltered. She turned toward the window, the sunlight casting long shadows across the room. "You don't understand what it's like to watch your child make a mistake," she said quietly. "Dorothy wasn't a mistake," he said firmly. Patricia glanced back at him, her eyes cool. "Aaron and we only wanted to protect you. Emma was hired to test her resolve, yes, but the photo, it was meant to open her eyes to the reality that she didn't belong in your world." Jackson took a step back, as though the revelation had struck him physically. "You're telling me you staged the whole thing? That you and Aaron orchestrated this?" Patricia's silence was answer enough. "I trusted you," he said, his voice breaking. "You took everything from me. And for what? Some twisted idea of what my life should look like." Patricia's gaze hardened. "Dorothy will only bring you trouble, Jackson. She already has. You've spent years trying to build something of value, and now you're willing to throw it all away for—" "Stop," Jackson interrupted, his voice like a whip. "You don't get to decide what has value in my life. You don't get to decide who I love." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Jackson turned toward the door, his steps deliberate. As he reached the threshold, her voice stopped him. "If you think this changes anything, you're wrong. Dorothy will never fit into this family. She'll ruin you, Jackson." He didn't turn back. "You already did that, Mother." The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, leaving Patricia alone in the cavernous room. Outside, the air felt heavier than before. Jackson sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his thoughts a chaotic storm. His mother's words rang in his ears, but they only strengthened his resolve. Whatever his family had destroyed, he would rebuild. He owed that much to Dorothy and to their sons. The sun hung low in the Houston sky as Jackson parked his car outside the apartment. His conversation with Patricia still churned in his mind, a volatile mixture of anger and regret. He stepped out, steeling himself for what was to come. Dorothy deserved the truth, no matter how difficult it was to share. Inside, the apartment was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the boys playing in their room. Dorothy sat at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. "You're back," she said simply, her tone giving nothing away. Jackson nodded, slipping his coat off and draping it over a chair. "We need to talk." Her grip on the mug tightened, but she didn't move. "I'm listening." He sat across from her, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I went to see my mother today. I needed answers, and now I have them." Dorothy's eyes narrowed slightly, her suspicion evident. "And?" Jackson drew a deep breath, his shoulders tense. "The photo you saw, the one that made you leave. It was staged. My mother and Aaron orchestrated the whole thing. They hired Emma, set up the situation, and made sure you would see it." Dorothy's fingers loosened, and the mug trembled slightly against the table. She stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and pain. "You're saying it was all fake?" Jackson nodded. "I didn't know at the time. That day, Emma said she wasn't feeling well. We were at the hotel for a business meeting, and I helped her get a room to rest. That's all it was. Nothing happened." His voice broke slightly, the weight of the confession pressing down on him. "I had no idea there was a photo. I didn't know they used it to drive you away." Dorothy leaned back, her arms crossing over her chest like a shield. Her breath came unevenly as she processed his words. "So, you're telling me," she said slowly, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and anguish, "that for 5 years, everything I believed was a lie. That I tore our lives apart because of a fabrication." Jackson's jaw tightened, his eyes filled with regret. "Yes, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Dorothy. You didn't deserve that. None of us did." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window, her hands running through her hair. The city lights flickered against the glass, but she didn't see them. "I don't even know how to feel right now," she said, her voice cracking. "It's been 5 years, Jackson. 5 years I spent believing you betrayed me. 5 years of raising our boys alone." He rose too, keeping his distance. "I know. I'll never be able to bring those years back to you. But I want to make things right. I want to make things right for you, for Dennis, and for Daniel. If you'll let me." Her shoulders sagged slightly, the anger ebbing to exhaustion. "This doesn't just erase everything, Jackson. The pain, the mistrust. It doesn't go away overnight." "I don't expect it to," he said softly. "But I'm not going anywhere, Dorothy. Not again. If you've heard this far and are curious about the ending of the series, leave us a signal by commenting tiramisu. Without wasting your time, we'll continue the story right here." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his for something. Truth, reassurance, maybe both. The following days passed in an uneasy truce. Dorothy remained guarded, but the walls she had built were no longer impenetrable. Jackson focused on the boys, his efforts genuine and tireless. He read to them, played games with them, and answered their endless questions with patience Dorothy hadn't expected. Ever the energetic one, Dennis quickly bonded with Jackson, drawing him into his world of curiosity and imagination. Daniel, slower to trust, began to follow his lead. One afternoon, Dorothy caught Jackson teaching Daniel how to tie his shoes. "Like this," Jackson said, his voice soft but steady. "Loop it. Pull it through. There you go." Daniel looked up, a shy smile spreading across his face. "Thanks, Dad." The word struck Jackson with force. His throat tightened, but he managed to smile back. "Anytime, buddy." Dorothy watched from the doorway, her hand pressed against the frame. The sight stirred something in her, something fragile but undeniable. On Saturday, Jackson proposed a family outing. "There's a park not far from here," he suggested. "The boys can run around and we can just get out of the house for a while." Dorothy hesitated, but the excitement of the boys tilted the balance. The day was bright and clear, the park bustling with families. Dennis and Daniel raced across the grass, their laughter infectious. For a moment, Dorothy allowed herself to relax, sitting on a bench beside Jackson. "You're simpatico with them," she said quietly, surprising even herself. Jackson turned to her, his expression warm. "They make it easy." Before she could respond, a shrill cry cut through the air. Dorothy's head snapped up, her heart plummeting as she saw Dennis collapse onto the grass. "Dennis!" she shouted, bolting toward him. Jackson was already there, scooping the boy into his arms. "Call an ambulance," he said, his voice tight with panic. Dorothy fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. As the ambulance arrived, the world blurred into a cacophony of sirens and frantic movement. Dorothy clung to Daniel, who was sobbing, while Jackson climbed into the ambulance with Dennis. Her heart pounded as she watched the vehicle speed away, Jackson's pale face visible through the rear window. Standing in the empty park, Dorothy held Daniel tightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her mind raced with questions and fears, but one thought shone brighter than the rest. They couldn't lose Dennis. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated every corner, revealing sterile walls and the quiet bustle of nurses and doctors moving with practiced urgency. Dorothy sat on the edge of a hard plastic chair, clutching Daniel to her chest as though holding him tighter could stop the tremor in her own hands. Jackson paced the length of the waiting room, his face pale, his tie askew. Every so often his gaze flicked toward the swinging double doors where Dennis had disappeared, carried away on a stretcher. The boy's face, so pale and still, haunted him. A nurse entered, her clipboard tucked under one arm. "Mr. Carter!" Jackson turned sharply, his heart in his throat. "How is he?" "He's stable for now," the nurse said, her voice calm but serious. "The doctors are running tests to determine the cause of his collapse. We'll update you as soon as we have more information." Dorothy's voice broke through the tension. "Can we see him?" The nurse hesitated. "He's in the pediatric ward. Only one parent at a time. For now." Jackson glanced at Dorothy, his expression torn. She nodded, understanding his unspoken request. "Go," she said softly. He disappeared through the doors without another word, leaving Dorothy and Daniel alone in the suffocating quiet. In the ward, Dennis lay in a small hospital bed, an IV snaking into his arm. Machines beeped steadily beside him, their rhythm the only reassurance that life still clung to him. Jackson sank into the chair beside the bed, his head dropping into his hands. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." An hour later, a doctor called both Jackson and Dorothy into a small consultation room. The tension in the air was palpable as they sat across from the young man in the white coat, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Lane," the doctor began, folding his hands on the desk. "Dennis's tests show he has aplastic anemia. It's a condition where the bone marrow doesn't produce enough blood cells." Dorothy's breath hitched, her fingers digging into the armrest of her chair. "What does that mean? Can he recover?" The doctor's gaze softened. "The condition is life-threatening if untreated, but there are options. He'll need a bone marrow transplant to survive." Jackson leaned forward, his voice tense. "What do we do?" "Test us. We'll do whatever it takes." The doctor nodded. "We'll test both of you," to see if you're a match. If neither of you is, we'll search for a donor. Time is critical, so we'll need to act quickly. The following day, the results came back. Neither Jackson nor Dorothy was a match. The news hit them like a punch, the air in the room seeming to thin. We'll search the donor registry, the doctor assured them. But finding a match can take time, and Dennis doesn't have much of it. Jackson felt the walls closing in. He racked his brain for options, his mind landing on one name he'd avoided for days. Aaron. Later that evening, Jackson stood in the dimly lit hallway outside Dennis's room. Dorothy was inside, reading softly to the boy, her voice trembling, but steady. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact he hadn't dialed in days. Finally, he pressed it. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Jackson. This is unexpected. Jackson's jaw tightened. Aaron, I don't have time for small talk. I need your help. There was a pause. Help? From me? That's rich. It's not for me, Jackson said, his voice breaking slightly. It's for Dennis, my son. He needs a bone marrow transplant, and neither Dorothy nor I am a match. You're the closest family we have left. Aaron's silence was deafening. Jackson could almost hear the older man's hesitation, the weight of old wounds and guilt. Where do I need to go? Aaron finally said, his voice quieter now. 2 days later, Aaron arrived at the hospital, his presence as jarring as a ghost from a painful past. Dorothy stiffened when she saw him, her protective instincts flaring, but Jackson placed a steadying hand on her arm. He's here to help, Jackson said softly. Aaron nodded, his eyes uncharacteristically humble. I'll do whatever it takes. The test results came in the next morning. Jackson and Dorothy waited in tense silence as the doctor entered the consultation room, a folder in hand. You'll be relieved to know, the doctor began with a faint smile. Aaron is a match. Dorothy exhaled sharply, her hands covering her face as relief washed over her. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his chest heaving with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Aaron, standing quietly in the corner, simply nodded. Let's get started, then. As Aaron was prepped for the donation, Dorothy stood outside the operating room, watching him through the glass. For the first time, she saw not the man who had torn her life apart, but the man who might save her son. The weight of the past hadn't lifted, but in that moment, hope flickered in its place. Aaron lay on the bed, pale and drained, his usual commanding presence diminished. He lay on the bed, pale and drained, his usual commanding presence diminished. The toll of the bone marrow donation was evident in the deep lines etched across his face and the stiffness in his posture. Yet, when Jackson entered, Aaron's eyes opened, sharp and unwavering despite the physical exhaustion. Jackson hesitated near the door, his hands shoved into his pockets, his movements uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident man he usually was. This wasn't a conversation he had prepared for, but it was one he couldn't avoid. Don't just stand there like a stranger, Aaron said, his voice gravelly but steady. Sit. Jackson pulled a chair to the bedside, the legs scraping softly against the tiled floor. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on his uncle's weathered features. How are you feeling? He asked at last, his voice low. Aaron let out a dry chuckle, the sound more air than laughter. It felt as if someone had struck me with a sledgehammer. But I'll survive. Jackson nodded, his jaw tightening. Thank you for doing this. Aaron waved a weak hand, dismissing the gratitude. It's the least I could do. His voice grew softer, tinged with something Jackson couldn't quite place. You shouldn't have had to call me. None of this should have happened. Jackson leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're right, it shouldn't have." His words were sharp, but his tone lacked malice. "But it did. And now we're here." Aaron sighed, his chest rising and falling heavily. "I made mistakes, Jackson. I thought I was protecting you, keeping you focused on what mattered, building your future, your legacy." He turned his head slightly, meeting Jackson's gaze. "I see now that I was wrong." Jackson's fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. "You didn't just make mistakes, Aaron. You destroyed lives. You and my mother decided Dorothy wasn't decent enough, and you tore us apart." His voice cracked, the anger slipping into something rawer, something closer to pain. Aaron didn't flinch under the weight of Jackson's words. Instead, he nodded, accepting them. "You're right," he said simply. "We did. I did. And it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. "I hated you," Jackson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hated what you did, how you justified it. But now, seeing you here, doing this for Dennis." He trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of the conflicting emotions swirling within him. Aaron's lips curved into a faint, worn smile. "Jackson, redemption is not an easy journey. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that it's never too late to try." Jackson's shoulders sagged slightly, the tension easing. He looked down at his hands, their silence becoming more forgiving. "You're doing the right thing," Jackson said finally, his voice steady. "For Dennis. For all of us." Aaron's smile widened just a fraction. "I'm trying." Later that evening, Jackson stood in the hallway outside Aaron's room, his head resting against the cool wall. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but for the first time in a long while, it felt manageable, like a burden he could share. Dorothy approached, her footsteps soft against the tiled floor. She stopped beside him, her expression unreadable. "How is he?" "He's tired," Jackson replied, straightening his posture. "But he's okay." Dorothy nodded, her gaze drifting toward the door. She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I want to see him." Jackson's brow lifted in mild surprise. "Are you sure?" She glanced at him, her eyes steady. "He saved Dennis's life. I owe him that much." Jackson stepped aside, watching as she pushed the door open and disappeared inside. Aaron looked up as Dorothy entered, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer. "Dorothy," he greeted, his voice faint. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." Dorothy closed the door behind her, the click of the latch louder than she intended. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, moving to the chair Jackson had vacated earlier. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Dorothy's fingers tightened around her arms as she searched for a way to begin. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, her voice quieter now. Aaron turned his head to look at her. His eyes, worn but clear, held none of the arrogance she remembered. "I owed it to him," he said simply. "To Dennis, to Jackson, and to you." Her brow furrowed, her defenses rising instinctively. "Don't think this erases what you did." "I don't," he replied quickly, his tone earnest. "I'm not looking for forgiveness, Dorothy. I don't deserve it. But I had to do something, anything, to make things right." She looked at him, her arms dropping to her sides. "You tore my life apart, Aaron. You and Patricia. You didn't just take Jackson away from me. You took his sons away from him. Do you even understand what that means?" Aaron's expression darkened, his guilt etched into the lines of his face. "I understand it better now than I did then," he admitted. "At the time, I thought I was protecting Jackson, protecting the family. But all I did was destroy it. I see that now. I've seen it every day for the past 5 years. Dorothy's throat tightened, her anger mingling with a pang of unexpected pity. Why now? She asked. Why help now? After everything? Aaron exhaled heavily, his gaze dropping to his hands. I witnessed his disintegration, Dorothy. I watched Jackson lose the light he once had. And then I saw Dennis, so small and fragile. And I knew I had to help. For them. For you. Even if it doesn't change anything between us. Her eyes burned, and she blinked rapidly to hold back the tears threatening to fall. She didn't want to feel compassion for him, nor did she want to see the man beneath the damage he'd caused. You've caused so much pain, she said, her voice trembling. You can't just fix it with one beneficial deed. I know, he said softly, but I had to start somewhere. Dorothy gazed at him for an extended period, her emotions tumultuous. Finally, she stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her. Thank you, she said quietly. For Dennis, for helping him. Aaron's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. It's the least I could do. Later, Jackson entered the room, his steps hesitant. Aaron looked up at his nephew, his expression unreadable. Dorothy told me you wanted to see me, Jackson said, stopping near the foot of the bed. Aaron nodded, his face softening slightly. Sit, he said. Jackson pulled up a chair, his posture stiff, his arms resting on his knees. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history pressing heavily between them. I owe you an apology, Aaron began, his voice steady but low. Jackson's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. You think an apology is enough? No, Aaron admitted, but it's all I have. Jackson leaned back, his expression hard. You destroyed everything, Aaron. You helped my mother tear my family apart. You made Dorothy believe I betrayed her. You made me miss the first 5 years of my sons' lives. How do I forgive that? Aaron's gaze didn't waver. You don't, he said simply, but I hope you'll let me help you move forward. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to make sure you never have to feel that kind of loss again. Jackson's lips formed a delicate line. His gratitude for Aaron's sacrifice clashed with his lingering resentment. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. You've taken the first step. Let's see if you can keep going. Aaron gave a faint smile, his exhaustion evident. Fair enough. For the first time, Dorothy saw a glimmer of the family they might become. A fragile hope that perhaps, even after everything, redemption was possible. The hospital hallways buzzed quietly with the muted sounds of life, the steady beeping of monitors, the soft shuffle of nurses, the hum of wheels against the polished floor. Dorothy walked slowly toward the pediatric ward, her thoughts heavy with the weight of everything that had unfolded. Daniel clutched her hand tightly, his wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. She was halfway to Dennis's room when she stopped abruptly, spotting a familiar figure standing near the nurse's station. Patricia. The older woman's presence was both commanding and oddly subdued. Her tailored coat hung neatly over her arm, a bouquet of daisies and a small, brightly wrapped toy resting against her chest. Dorothy froze, unsure whether to retreat or approach. Patricia turned, her gaze locking with Dorothy's. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them crackling with unresolved tension. I didn't think you'd still be here, Patricia said, breaking the silence. Her tone was calm, almost casual, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. I could say the same for you, Dorothy replied, her voice measured. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked toward the ward, her expression unreadable. "Aaron called me," she said finally. "Told me everything." Dorothy's stomach tightened. "Did he?" Patricia nodded, her gaze shifting back to Dorothy. "I suppose he thought I needed to understand the consequences of my actions." "And do you?" Dorothy asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Patricia flinched, a flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossing her face. She took a step closer, holding out the bouquet and the toy. "These are for Dennis," she said, her tone softening. "I thought he might like them." Dorothy hesitated before taking the items. The flowers were simple but elegant, their bright petals a stark contrast to the heaviness of the moment. The toy was a small stuffed bear, its cheerful grin almost mocking. "Thank you," Dorothy said, her voice guarded. Patricia's eyes lingered on her grandson, who clung tightly to Dorothy's leg. For a brief moment, her icy demeanor melted, replaced by something almost maternal. "He's a beautiful boy," Patricia said quietly. Dorothy glanced down at Daniel, brushing a hand over his curls. "He is." Patricia straightened, her mask of composure slipping back into place. "I should go," she said, stepping back. "I didn't come here to intrude. I just wanted to see how he was doing." Before Dorothy could respond, Patricia turned and began walking away. Jackson arrived moments later, his face tight with concern. He spotted Patricia disappearing down the hallway and immediately tensed. "What was she doing here?" he demanded, his voice low but intense. "She brought flowers and a toy for Dennis," Dorothy replied, watching his reaction carefully. Jackson's jaw clenched. "I don't trust her. She's already done enough damage. I won't let her—" "Jackson," Dorothy interrupted, placing a hand on his arm. "Let her go." His brow furrowed as he turned to her. "You think I should just let her waltz in here like nothing happened? She almost ruined us." Dorothy's gaze softened, her voice steady. "She's a mother, Jackson. Everything she did, as misguided as it was, she did because she thought she was protecting you. I don't agree with her choices, but I understand them." Jackson's expression wavered, his anger giving way to a reluctant understanding. "And you trust her now?" "I don't know if I'll ever trust her," Dorothy admitted, "but I see someone trying in her own way to make amends, and that has to count for something." Jackson exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "She has a lot to answer for." "She does," Dorothy agreed, "but we're not the only ones carrying the weight of the past. Let her carry hers. We have enough to handle on our own." The bouquet sat in a small vase on Dennis's bedside table, its bright petals bringing a touch of color to the otherwise sterile room. The stuffed bear rested against Dennis's pillow, a small smile on his pale face as he slept. Dorothy stood at the foot of the bed, watching him breathe, her hand brushing against Daniel's curls. Jackson stood beside her, his arm lightly touching hers. In that moment, the weight of Patricia's actions felt distant, overshadowed by the fragile hope of Dennis's recovery and the quiet resilience of their family. Later that night, as Dorothy sat alone by Dennis's bed, the hospital quiet around her, she found herself turning Patricia's words over in her mind. The past wasn't something she could forget, but perhaps, for the sake of her sons, she could learn to move forward. The days following Dennis's surgery passed in a blur of cautious optimism. His color began to return. The shadows beneath his eyes faded, and his once faint voice grew steadier. Dorothy and Jackson divided their time between the hospital and home, slowly settling into a rhythm that, while fragile, carried the seeds of something enduring. One evening, Dorothy walked into the kitchen to find Jackson sitting at the table with Daniel, carefully assembling a puzzle. The boy's tongue poked out in concentration as he fit the last piece into place. "There," Jackson said, his voice warm. "Perfect fit. Just like a team, huh?" Daniel beamed, his shy smile lighting up his face. Dorothy lingered in the doorway, the quiet domesticity of the scene stirring something deep within her. "You're simpatico with him," she said softly, stepping into the room. Jackson glanced up, a small smile playing on his lips. "He makes it easy." Dorothy didn't respond, but her chest tightened at the sight. It wasn't just Jackson's attentiveness to the boys that tugged at her. It was the patience, the care, and the unwavering determination to be present. Over time, small moments accumulated, forming the foundation of something Dorothy had thought lost. During shared meals, Jackson inquired about the boys' favorite games and assisted Daniel in managing his fussy eating habits. During bedtime stories, Dennis insisted that Jackson perform all the voices. Jackson would sit opposite Dorothy during quiet conversations late at night, freely sharing his thoughts without ever being demanding. One evening, after tucking the boys into bed, Dorothy found Jackson standing on the balcony, a glass of water in his hand. The city lights shimmered around him, casting his face in a soft glow. She joined him, leaning against the railing. "You've been different," she said, her voice barely audible above a whisper. He turned to her, his brow furrowed slightly. "Different." She nodded. "Your drive was unwavering. You were always focused on your work. However, it appears that you've discovered a method to slow down." Jackson chuckled softly, setting his glass down. "I had to lose everything to realize what mattered most. What mattered most, Dorothy, was never work. It was always you and them." Her heart clenched, the sincerity in his voice cutting through the layers of doubt she'd built around herself. "I'm trying to trust again," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not easy." "I know," he said, "and I don't expect it to be. But I'll be here, for as long as it takes." A week later, as Dennis's recovery continued, Jackson surprised Dorothy during one of their quiet moments. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "About what?" she asked, tilting her head. Jackson reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box. Dorothy's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring. "I don't want to waste any more time," he said. "I want us to be a family again, officially. I know it's soon, and I know there's still a lot we need to work through, but I love you, Dorothy. I've always loved you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that." Dorothy stared at the ring, her emotions warring within her. It was everything she had once dreamed of, but the weight of the past still lingered. "Jackson," she began, her voice steady but soft, "this means more to me than I can say. But I need time. I need time to ensure I'm ready, to make sure we're ready." His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded, his smile understanding. "Take all the time you need. The offer will always be here." A few days later, a package arrived at the apartment. Jackson opened it to find a neatly wrapped box and a letter addressed to him. Dorothy joined him as he unfolded the paper, Aaron's familiar handwriting filling the page. "Jackson, by the time you read this, I'll be on my way to New York. My daughter has invited me to stay with her, and I think it's time I leave Houston behind. Helping Dennis reminded me of what truly matters, and while I can't undo the damage I've caused, I hope I've taken a small step toward mending what was broken. I wish you, Dorothy, and the boys all the happiness in the world. You deserve it. Aaron." Inside the box was a set of handmade wooden blocks, intricately carved and painted. Jackson turned them over in his hands, his expression unreadable. Dorothy placed a hand on his arm. "It's his way of saying goodbye," she said softly. Jackson nodded, his grip tightening around the blocks. "And maybe it's his way of starting over." As Dorothy watched Jackson carefully place the blocks on the shelf in the boys' room, she felt a shift within herself, a tentative but undeniable hope. Perhaps, she thought, they could truly rebuild. A setting sun bathed the garden in golden hues, its warm light casting long shadows across the rows of neatly arranged chairs. White flowers adorned the edges of the aisle, their soft petals fluttering in the breeze. The air was filled with the low murmur of close friends and the occasional giggle from the boys who stood near Jackson, each dressed in a smart suit. Dennis and Daniel held small velvet boxes in their hands, their excitement barely contained. Dennis whispered something to his brother, and Daniel nodded solemnly, clutching his box tighter. Jackson stood at the end of the aisle, his suit crisp and his tie slightly askew, a small tell of his nervous energy. His eyes, however, were steady, focused on the far end of the path where Dorothy would appear. Dorothy took a deep breath, standing just out of sight. The soft fabric of her dress brushed against her legs, and she clutched a small bouquet of lavender and white roses. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but anticipation, a delicate, overwhelming mix of emotions that coursed through her with each passing second. As the music began, she stepped forward, the soft notes guiding her down the aisle. She lifted her gaze, and there he was, Jackson. He was the man who had shattered her heart and now aided in its reconstruction. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw the unwavering love and determination that had carried them to this moment. With every step, the weight of their shared journey pressed gently against her chest, the scars of the past mingling with the hope of the future. The boys stood beside Jackson, their faces lighting up as she approached. When she reached the end, Jackson extended his hand. She hesitated for the briefest of moments before placing hers in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "You're stunning," he whispered, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. A small smile touched her lips. "You don't look too awful yourself." The officiant began to speak, but Dorothy's focus was entirely on Jackson. The vows they exchanged were simple but powerful, each word a testament to the journey they had endured. "I vow to never take us for granted again," Jackson said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "To honor the strength it took for you to trust me again, to be the man you and the boys deserve." Tears shimmered in Dorothy's eyes as she responded, her voice trembling but resolute. "I vow to let go of the fear that kept us apart. I promise to construct a life with you that may not be flawless, but it will be uniquely ours. I want to, once again, become the partner you've shown me I can be." The world seemed to still as they slipped the rings onto each other's fingers, the small bands of gold shining in the fading light. The ceremony ended with laughter, as Dennis and Daniel proudly carried the rings to their parents, each boy determined to present his box first. Jackson crouched down, pulling both of them into a tight hug. "We did it, boys," he said, his voice thick with pride. "We're officially a team." Dorothy knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around the group. It was a messy, beautiful embrace, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. From a distance, Patricia watched the scene unfold. She stood near the edge of the garden, her figure silhouetted against the glow of the setting sun. Her expression was unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't approach, didn't say a word. But as the newly formed family laughed and embraced, something in her stance softened. The celebration was small, but warm, filled with clinking glasses, shared stories, and the sound of Dennis and Daniel chasing each other through the garden. Dorothy found herself laughing freely, her hand often finding Jackson's as they navigated the evening together. As the night wound down, Jackson and Dorothy stood at the edge of the garden, watching the boys chase fireflies under the twinkling fairy lights strung through the trees. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" she asked, leaning against him. Jackson slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Not for a while," he admitted, "but I knew I'd fight for it. For us." She tilted her head up, her eyes shining. "And now?" "Now," he said, his voice soft but certain. "I know this is where we were always meant to be." Dorothy rested her head against his shoulder, her gaze drifting to their boys. The laughter of their children filled the air, blending seamlessly with the quiet hum of the night. Patricia stood near the gate as the guests began to leave, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She turned away without a word, her head held high, but her steps slow and deliberate. In the garden, Jackson pulled Dorothy into a gentle embrace, their boys joining in as they all collapsed onto the grass in a tangle of laughter and love. The scars of the past would always remain, but in that moment they were simply a family, whole and unbreakable. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.